on Janome Club, we will be looking at the lap seam foot. Now, most of you will be familiar with denim jeans, and if you have a look at your inside seam on the jeans, generally they are done with what we call a lap seam. Now, a lap seam, if I bring in this little example, you can sort of see what it is that I've sewn my fabric together. Then what the actual lap seam foot does is it folds your fabric raw edges in under itself and then top stitches it down. So that seam is fully enclosed, there's no raw edges, and because it's sort of folded over itself and then stitched down, it makes it very strong. So that's why you'll often see this lap seam on denim, and specifically on the inner leg seam, because there's a lot of wear and tear. If you think of, traditionally those riding horses, it's a lot of wear and tear on that inner seam. So that's the one that generally has got that extra sort of toughness to it because it's all folded in together. So our lovely lap seam is available. It's a brand new foot that came out last year, and it is only available for 9mm machines. So you can just check with your Janome stockist to whether you can use this for your model. And like always, our feet do come with a little blister pack information sheet. So in here it's got information about how you stitch the seam, and then the different finishes that you can get with it and setting everything up. So that's there with our little blister pack. So let's have a look at our foot. It's quite a long foot here because it has the attaching part here. It's got a mark on it for our center needle position because that is what we're using. And then it's got this channel section at the front. Now this channel you can see is quite wide here at the front, and then it tapers down to near where your needle will go, and that is for when the seam, if we bring this in, when we're stitching this seam, the raw edges of the seam are at the front of the foot, and as it stitches it folds that under and you get that perfect lap seam. So let's go and attach this to our foot, to our machine, sorry. So with the lap seam foot using our center needle straight stitch position, we are going to also change over to our straight stitch needle plate. So depending on your machine, your needle plate will either have 2, if it's an older machine, or 3 holes here where the needle sits. And what we use the straight stitch needle plate for is we often use it for free motion quilting, for embroidery, or for anything where we're using straight stitch needle plate. So say you're doing walking foot quilting on a large quilt using your AccuFeed foot, you would then switch over to this foot. What that little single hole does over a zigzag needle plate is it holds your needle in that spot, and you don't get any needle flex left or right. Also, you don't get any fabric, especially when you're starting a seam, you don't get any fabric being pulled down into the needle plate. So it is a very stable plate to use. You also will find on all of our needle plates you have needle plate markings. Because we're using this lap seam foot to sew seams from a dress pattern, most commercial patterns do utilize a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we can look on our needle plate, and we have our 5/8 of a mark at the top here. So at the top, this section here has got all our imperial markings. And then down the bottom here we have our metric. So this first line here is our 1.5 centimeter seam. And then if we move down to the front of the needle plate, we also have our 5/8 and our 1/2 centimeter needle plate markings. And then if we continue right down to the front, we have another little marking right at the front here. So when we place our fabric on here, we have markings from the front, the needle plate door, and all the way towards the back of where we are going to line that fabric up to do our sewing. So let's swap over our needle plate and attach our foot. I'm going to lock our machine on the Continental, and it pops up my needle plate. You may have a machine where you have to press a lever to put your needle plate on, or you might have some screws that you unscrew. Now when you do take your needle plate off to change it over, it's always a good time as well to give your machine a little clean out. We're then going to take our foot, and like any of our feet that attach to our regular foot shank, I like to give it a little bit of a upwards pressure as I push the little lever at the back, and that attaches my foot there. So we're going to take our 2 pieces of fabric, and first of all we're going to put our 2 pieces of fabric, oh, we've got our wrong pieces, we'll put them this way. We're going to do one first, which is right sides together. So this would be a standard way you would sew a seam. You put your right sides together and you stitch the seam. We're going to line up with our 5/8 of an inch marking on our needle plate, or our 1.5 centimeter, and we're going to stitch our seam. Once you have sewn your seam, you then need to trim off one side. I'm going to get our scissors. Now it states in the instructions to trim this off to about 5 millimeters, as long as it's less than about 1/3. So you're cutting off pretty much 2/3 of that seam. There we go. Then you want to give it a little press in the direction we're going to fold it. And the first thing you're going to do is just set the front of the seam. So we might swap over here and I'll show you what we're going to do. So here's our little seam allowance here that's been sewn, and we've got that section that's been cut and trimmed, and we've got this larger section here. We're going to fold the start of that over till it just almost touches the stitch line, and then fold it over that second time, and we're ready to start sewing. We put it under the foot, and on the foot there is the needle position mark on the front of the foot, and there's also another one down the front as well. We're going to lower our foot, and we're just going to stitch a couple of stitches just to set that seam and lock it all into place. Now we raise our foot up so that we can hook this front section up and over the little guide on the foot, and then we can start sewing again. As we sew, you'll notice that this little section that's got all the raw edges is being folded over by the foot, and then goes nice and flat underneath where the needle is, and gets stitched into place. So the foot is doing all of the work for us. So this is the underside here of the seam, and when we turn that over, we have our nice lapped seam, and our seam is here, and then we've got one row of stitching. So this is one finish that you can get, which has got a single row of stitching on there. So we've put our fabrics right sides together, and then we've stitched one row of stitching is shown. So the other way that we can sew this to get a different finish is that we take our 2 pieces of fabric and we actually put them wrong sides together. So we have the outside of the fabric on the outsides, and the wrong side of the fabric is facing each other. So it's sort of the opposite of what we think it should be, but this will create a different finish for us. We're going to line up the edge of our fabric with that 5/8 or 1.5 centimeter inch mark, 1.5 centimeter marking. We're going to stitch our seam. Exactly the same as we did before. We're then going to trim one layer off. Again, it's about 5 millimeters or just under 1/3. trimmed that off. Now we're going to set our seam again. So we're just going to press that with our fingers. We're going to fold over just the top section, place it under the foot, make those first couple of stitches, and once that's all secure, we raise our foot up and we hook it into that little guide at the front again. Then as we sew, it's going to roll over that front edge again, the raw edges, fold them all in for us, and we are now top stitching. So now if I bring this one in here, you will see now we have 2 rows of stitching that are shown. So on the underside, we've just got the 1 row, and now we've got the 2 rows showing. So you've got those options, and I'll bring in another example here for you to see. So here again is your 1 row of stitching. Then we have our 2 rows of stitching. Now the other option you've got, and if we look back here to our jacket, you will see on our, when we get our lovely camera in place, you'll notice on most denim jackets or jeans, this is a lovely denim jacket we've got, you'll notice on most of them that they use a nice thick thread. So that is an option that you've got. You can utilize a thick thread and you can stitch those seams. So if you are going to go for a thicker thread, you just need to make sure you have the right needle. It may be either a size 16 denim needle if you are using your jeans, or you may be able to use also something like a size 14 top stitch needle. Just depends a little bit on the actual weight of your thread that you've purchased. And again, you can ask your local Janome stockist and purchase the thread, and then they can advise the correct needle for that thread that you're buying. So I've got here a little example that I'll show with the thicker thread, that you can then see that, and I might put it side by side with the normal sort of thin thread. So obviously when you're using a thicker thread, it's going to stand out more. So here you can see like that darker pink. And if you do want the 2 rows of stitching, you do need to actually sew the seam with the thicker thread as well as doing the top stitching. Okay. So another thing that you can utilize this foot for, let's move these all out of the way. Another thing you can do is, I'm not sure now which camera we're on, this one, is you can do small seams with this. So this is a 1.5 inch finished seam that is stitched down with this. So you don't need to take this to your iron and continually press under your seam allowance and things like that. You just need to press up your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and you can stitch it with the lap seam foot. So here's my piece of fabric, and I've pressed up my 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. We then take that over to our foot. Again, we just set the start of the seam. So I'm just folding in the little raw edge, place it under the foot, and start sewing. Once it's done a couple of stitches, do exactly the same as we were doing for the seaming, is that I just hook it over the front of the foot and then we sew. And that seam will get nicely folded in for us and stitched down. Now this will only work on straight hems, so generally like the hem of a skirt that you've made, or maybe like a sleeve hem. It will only work on a straight hem, not a curved seam. So that's just one thing to take into account. And then we have our beautiful hemmed fabric, and if we turn that over, you can see there that that's nicely stitched. Now another option that you can utilize this foot for is, I'll bring this in. This is a small little quilted panel that I'm making as a quilt as you go, and what we've done is we've used the lap seam foot to stitch down these strips of fabric to create a different pattern on all our blocks, and then we've joined the blocks together. So I'll take you over to the machine and I'll show you an example of this being stitched down. So we've got a strip of contrast fabric here that's stitched onto our fabric. So this could be a little quilt. We're just stitching it on a piece of fabric to show you as well to start with. So what we're doing is we're starting with a 1-inch strip of fabric, and we're going to take our piece of fabric here, and if you wanted to mark a line on your fabric of where you're going to sew, we're going to place our piece of fabric down, our strip onto our fabric, and we're going to line up at the front of our foot. You've got the little guide, and then there's the little channel where the lap seam sort of pokes up. That's where we're lining up the raw edge of our fabric to, and we're going to sew this. So this would be the same as if we were seaming our two pieces together, but we're just placing a piece of fabric on top. And stitch along there. So there's our piece of fabric that's been stitched. We are then going to press this just with our fingers over, and the same as we would with our lap seam when we're joining, we're just going to take this little section at the front and fold it over and fold it down so that we can put it under our foot just to secure that start. And then the same as we've done before, lift up the foot, we're going to hook that little bit into the guide, and then we can sew. This is really good because we haven't had to press the seam allowances under to sew these strips down. The foot is doing all the work for us. And here we have another strip stitched down. So you could add as many pieces as you want onto your fabric depending on what pattern you were doing. So if we go back over here, I can show you that we used it to stitch these pieces onto the smaller blocks. Then we've quilted these smaller blocks up, and then we've done a similar technique to join the pieces together. So it's just using that 1-inch strip of fabric, stitch it down, flip it over, and it top stitches on there, but it's actually joining the fabrics together. So let's have a little look at our project that is from this month, and it is this lovely bag here. So we've utilized this in a bag rather than in a garment, but obviously this is I said earlier, it's a very strong seam, so utilizing it on something like this, which would be a nice big shopping bag for doing your groceries, it does make all of those seams really strong. So you can put a nice panel in the front here, a piece of feature fabric, you could embroider out something and put it on the bag, and then all of the seams are done with that lap seam to make them really strong and sturdy. The other bonus is because they're finished seams with no raw edges, the inside is all nicely finished and you won't have any thread tails or anything like that coming off. Now just remember that all the instructions are written inside your lap seam foot depending on the finish you want. You don't have to remember what I've said in the video. On here it will state that if you want the two seams showing, you put your fabrics wrong sides together and vice versa. Plus, again, all the instructions are written there. Thank you very much for joining us this month.